In a small, sleepy town nestled in the heart of the southern United States, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The streets were lined with old oak trees whose branches stretched wide, casting long shadows over cracked sidewalks. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least pretended to. For Marcus Johnson, however, life here felt anything but welcoming. Though he had lived in this town for most of his adult life, he often found himself on the outside, looking in. Marcus was a tall man with broad shoulders and skin as dark as rich soil after a rainstorm. His hands were calloused from years of working as a mechanic, fixing cars that rolled into his garage with problems both big and small. He took pride in his work, knowing that each repaired engine or tightened bolt meant someone could get back, on the road safely. But no matter how skilled he was, it never quite seemed enough to earn him more than polite nods from the townsfolk. People would greet him when they needed his services, but beyond that, they kept their distance. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes, and their conversations rarely went beyond surface-level pleasantries. Despite the isolation, Marcus tried not to let it bother him too much. He had learned early on that dwelling on what others thought only led to bitterness. Instead, he focused on the things that brought him joy, tinkering with engines late into the night, listening to jazz records on Sunday afternoons, and taking long walks through the quiet streets. Life might have been lonely, but it wasn't unbearable. One crisp autumn morning, Marcus woke up feeling unusually restless. The air carried a chill that hinted winter was just around the corner, and golden leaves swirled across his front yard like tiny dancers caught in a breeze. As he sipped his coffee, something unusual caught his eye: a letter sitting on his kitchen table. It wasn't often that mail made its way to his house. Most days, it was nothing but bills or advertisements. But this envelope stood out immediately. Its edges were slightly worn, as if it had traveled far and wide before finally reaching him, and the handwriting on the front, bold yet familiar, sent a shiver down his spine. It had been years since Marcus last saw writing like that. Decades, even. The loops and curves belonged unmistakably to Elijah Carter, his childhood best friend. They had grown up together in Chicago, two boys who shared dreams bigger than the city itself. Back then, they spent every waking moment side by side, building makeshift forts in empty lots, racing bikes down busy streets, and dreaming of adventures beyond the confines of their neighborhood. But life had other plans for them. When Marcus moved away to pursue opportunities elsewhere, their friendship faded into memories buried deep beneath the weight of time. Now, holding this letter in his hands, Marcus couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and apprehension. What could Elijah possibly want after all these years? Was it good news, bad news, or maybe just a random trip down memory lane? Whatever the reason, one thing was certain: Marcus needed answers. And so, without giving himself too much time to second guess, he decided to take the letter to the local post office to verify its authenticity. After all, it wasn't addressed to him. It bore Elijah's name instead, and Marcus wanted to make sure it reached its rightful owner. The walk to the post office was short but filled with anticipation. The streets were quieter than usual, the hum of daily activity replaced by an eerie stillness. When Marcus pushed open the heavy wooden door of the post office, the bell above it jingled softly, announcing his arrival. Inside, the room smelled faintly of ink and paper, and rows of shelves stacked with envelopes and packages lined the walls. A few people milled about, some filling out forms while others waited patiently in line. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary enough. But almost instantly, Marcus noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned toward him, curious and wary all at once. An elderly woman clutching a stack of letters froze, her gaze lingering on him longer than necessary before she quickly looked away. Even the clerk behind the counter hesitated, her pen hovering uncertainly over a ledger. No one said a word, but the tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus ignored the stares as best he could and stepped forward, joining the queue. He told himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, that people weren't really judging him based on the color of his skin. Yet deep down, he knew better. This wasn't the first time he'd experienced such treatment, nor would it be the last. Still, He refused to let it deter him. All he wanted was to ensure the letter got where it needed to go. When it was finally his turn, Marcus approached the counter and slid the envelope across the polished surface. "Excuse me," he said politely, his voice steady despite the unease prickling at the edges of his mind. "I need some help verifying this letter. It's not mine, but I think it belongs to a friend." The clerk, a thin woman with sharp features and glasses perched precariously on her nose, picked up the envelope gingerly as though it might bite her. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she examined it closely. Then, without warning, her tone turned icy. "This isn't your name," she stated flatly, tapping the recipient's address with a bony finger. "You can't just bring random letters here expecting us to deal with them." "I'm not asking you to deal with it," Marcus replied evenly, though his pulse quickened. "I just want to confirm it's legitimate and figure out how to get it to my friend." The clerk's frown deepened. She glanced at him skeptically, her gaze sweeping over his face, his clothes, and finally settling on his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "And why should we trust you?" she asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "How do we know you're not trying to cause trouble?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. Trouble? The accusation stung, cutting, deeper than any insult ever had. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could utter a word, the murmurs around him grew louder. Someone muttered under their breath about how people like him always caused problems. Another voice chimed in, questioning why he couldn't stay out of places that didn't concern him. Each comment landed like a blow, chipping away at whatever composure he had left. For a fleeting moment, anger surged within Marcus. He wanted to argue, to demand respect and fairness, but experience had taught him that arguing wouldn't change minds. It rarely did in situations like this. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to remain calm. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the post office, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. Outside, the cool autumn air hit him like a slap, snapping him back to reality. He stood there for a moment, staring at the ground as emotions churned inside him. Frustration, hurt, determination. The letter may have started as a simple task, but now it represented something far greater. A reminder of the barriers he faced, daily simply because of who he was. As Marcus began walking home, his mind raced with possibilities. If the post office wouldn't help him, then he would find another way. He owed it to Elijah and to himself to see this through. Little did he know this decision would set off a chain of events that would alter the course of his life forever. Marcus walked home with heavy steps, the letter still clutched tightly in his hand. The encounter at the post office replayed in his mind like a broken record, each word and glance cutting deeper than before. He had faced prejudice before, small, slights disguised as politeness or outright hostility, but today felt different. Today, something inside him stirred, a quiet but unyielding resolve that refused to let the situation rest. Back in his modest house, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope as if it held secrets waiting to be unlocked. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Elijah's, bold, confident strokes that carried echoes of their shared childhood. Memories flooded back, summer afternoons spent building lemonade stands, late-night talks about dreams they'd chase when they grew up, and laughter so loud it echoed through the neighborhood. Those days seemed impossibly far away now, buried under layers of time and distance. Yet here was proof that those memories weren't entirely lost, that somewhere out there, Elijah still existed. But how could Marcus get the letter to him? The post office had turned its back, and trusting them again didn't feel like an option. For hours he sat in silence, his thoughts swirling like leaves caught in a whirlwind. Finally, an idea began to take shape, one bold enough to make his heart race but simple enough to seem possible. If no one else would help him deliver the letter, then he would do it himself. He would go to Chicago. The decision wasn't made lightly. Traveling to another city meant leaving behind the only life he'd known for years, the garage where he worked, the quiet streets he wandered, even the comfort of his own home. but the thought of giving up gnawed at him more than any inconvenience ever could. This letter wasn't just paper, it was a connection to a part of himself he hadn't realized he missed until now. And so, with determination burning in his chest, Marcus began making plans. The next morning he packed a small bag with essentials, a change of clothes, toiletries, and a few snacks for the journey. He left a note for his neighbor Mrs. Thompson, asking her to keep an eye on the house while he was gone. She was one of the few people in town who treated him kindly, always bringing over baked goods or stopping by for a chat. When she saw the note later that day, she shook her head in concern, wondering what had driven Marcus to leave so suddenly. Still, she promised to look after things until his return. With his bag slung over his shoulder, Marcus boarded the bus bound for Chicago. It was a long trip, spanning several states and countless miles. As the bus rumbled along highways flanked by fields of golden wheat and dense forests, Marcus found himself reflecting on his life. He thought about the choices he'd made, the paths not taken, and the walls he'd built around himself to shield against rejection. But most of all, he thought about Elijah. What kind of man had his childhood friend become? Would he even remember Marcus after all these years? The hours passed slowly, filled with stops at dingy rest areas and brief conversations with fellow passengers. A young mother sitting nearby struck up a friendly chat, her toddler giggling as she played with a toy car. An elderly man across the aisle shared stories of his youth, his voice crackling with nostalgia. Each interaction reminded Marcus of the humanity that connected people, despite the barriers society often erected between them. By the time the bus pulled into Chicago, night had fallen, casting the city in a glow of neon lights and bustling energy. Marcus stepped off the vehicle, his legs stiff from the long ride, and looked around in awe. The towering skyscrapers seemed to scrape the sky, their windows reflecting the moonlight like glittering jewels. Cars honked impatiently, weaving through traffic, while crowds of people hurried past, their faces illuminated by phone screens or streetlights. It was a world apart from the sleepy town he called home, a place alive with possibility. Following the address written on the envelope, Marcus navigated the unfamiliar streets. The farther he walked, the more the scenery shifted. Gleaming office buildings gave way to rows of brick apartments, their fire escapes zigzagging up weathered walls. Street vendors called out to passers-by, offering hot dogs, pretzels, and cups of steaming coffee. Music drifted from open windows, blending with the hum of conversation and distant sirens. Despite the chaos, there was a rhythm to the city that felt oddly comforting. Finally, he arrived at a modest apartment building nestled between a corner store and a laundromat. The paint on the facade was peeling, and the metal railing leading up to the entrance groaned under his weight as he climbed the stairs. His heart pounded with every step, anticipation mingling with nerves. What if Elijah didn't want to see him? What if the letter meant nothing to him anymore? Standing outside the door marked with the correct number, Marcus hesitated. He ran a hand over his face, steeling himself for whatever came next. Then, taking a deep breath, he knocked firmly. The sound echoed through the hallway, followed by a moment of silence that stretched longer than it should have. Just as Marcus began to wonder if anyone was home, the lock clicked and the door creaked open. A man stood there, blinking in surprise. His hair was streaked with gray and lines etched his face, but his eyes, those warm, familiar eyes, were unmistakable. "Marcus?" the man said, his voice tinged with disbelief. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Time seemed to freeze as they stared at each other, 2 decades melting away in an instant. Then, without warning, Elijah threw his arms around Marcus, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I can't believe it's really you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Tears pricked at the corners of Marcus's eyes as he hugged his old friend back. All the anger, frustration, and loneliness he'd carried with him dissolved, in that moment, replaced by a flood of warmth and belonging. They stood there for what felt like forever, holding on to each other as if afraid the other might disappear. When they finally pulled apart, Elijah led Marcus inside, ushering him into a cozy living room cluttered with books, photographs, and mementos of a life well lived. Sit down," Elijah urged, gesturing to a worn couch. Tell me everything. How did you end up here? Marcus sank into the cushions, still overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the reunion. Slowly, haltingly, he began to recount the events that had brought him to Chicago, the letter, the post office, the journey north. Elijah listened intently, his expression shifting from shock to anger to admiration as the story unfolded. And you came all this way? Just to bring me this? Elijah asked softly, nodding toward the envelope Marcus held. Wordlessly, Marcus handed it over. Elijah took it carefully, his fingers tracing the edges as though handling something precious. With deliberate care, he opened the envelope and pulled out its contents. Inside was a faded photograph of the two of them as children, standing proudly beside the lemonade stand they'd built together one sweltering summer afternoon. On the back, scribbled in childish handwriting, were the words, "Best friends forever." Elijah's breath hitched as he stared at the picture, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can't believe you kept this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "After all these years?" "It wasn't mine," Marcus admitted quietly. "Someone sent it to me, thinking it belonged to you." Elijah shook his head, smiling through his tears. "No, it belongs to both of us. To our friendship, our history." He paused, looking at Marcus with gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you for bringing it to me, for coming all this way." The two men sat together for hours, talking late into the night. They shared stories of their lives, the triumphs and struggles, the loves and losses, and marveled at how much they had changed while remaining fundamentally the same. At some point, Elijah disappeared into another room and returned with a framed photo of his family. In it, a young boy who bore a striking resemblance to Marcus grinned widely, his arm slung around Elijah's shoulders. "That's my son, Daniel," Elijah explained, pride evident in his tone. "He doesn't know much about our history, about where I came from or who I used to be. But I think it's time he learned." As dawn broke over the city, painting the skyline in hues of pink and gold, Marcus realized something profound. The journey hadn't been about delivering a letter. It had been about reconnecting with a piece of himself he thought he'd lost. And in doing so, he had discovered that true friendships, like the bonds forged in childhood, could endure even the longest separations. Though he knew he would eventually return to his quiet town, Marcus felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time, he understood that the scars of the past didn't define him. They only shaped the person he chose to become. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of rediscovered friendship, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The days that followed Marcus's arrival in Chicago passed in a blur of laughter, tears, and heartfelt conversations. Elijah had insisted that Marcus stay with him during his visit, and the two quickly fell into the rhythm of old friends picking up where they'd left off. They spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, cups of coffee growing cold as they shared stories from their lives. Marcus spoke about the quiet solitude of his small town, the satisfaction he found in fixing cars, and the subtle but persistent isolation he felt living among people who never truly accepted him. Elijah, in turn, talked about raising his son Daniel, navigating the challenges of adulthood, and finding purpose in teaching history at a local high school. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in fiery shades of orange and red, Elijah pulled out an old photo album. Its pages were worn and slightly yellowed with age, but the memories captured within were vivid and alive. As they flipped through the photographs together, Marcus couldn't help but laugh at the sight of their younger selves, skinny boys with mischievous grins, standing proudly beside makeshift forts or posing dramatically in hand-me-down suits for church events. Each picture brought back a flood of emotions: joy, nostalgia, and a pang of sadness for the years they'd lost touch. "This was the summer we tried to sell lemonade on every corner," Elijah said, pointing to a snapshot of the two of them, holding mismatched pitchers and Dixie cups. "Remember how we thought we'd be millionaires by the end of the week?" Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. We barely made enough to buy candy bars. But man, we sure had fun trying. Their reminiscing continued late into the night, interrupted only by the occasional yawn or stretch. Eventually, Elijah closed the album and leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus thoughtfully. You know, he began, his voice softer now. I always wondered what happened to you after you moved away. I kept meaning to write, but life got busy and, well, I guess I let too much time pass. It wasn't just you, Marcus replied, meeting his friend's gaze. I should have reached out too, but I think I convinced myself that moving on meant leaving everything behind, including you. Elijah nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. Sometimes, I think we all do that. We get so caught up in surviving that we forget how important it is to hold on to the things that make us who we are. The conversation lingered in the air between them, heavy with unspoken truths. For Marcus, being here with Elijah felt like stepping into a different world, a place where he didn't have to explain himself or prove his worth. Here he was simply Marcus, a son, a friend, a human being deserving of love and respect. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, and it filled him with both gratitude and a bittersweet longing for the life he'd left behind. The next morning, Elijah introduced Marcus to his family. Daniel, Elijah's teenage son, greeted him with polite curiosity, though it was clear he wasn't used to seeing his father so animated around someone new. Over breakfast, Elijah explained the significance of Marcus's visit, showing Daniel the faded photograph from the letter and recounting tales of their childhood adventures. At first, Daniel listened quietly, his expression skeptical, but as the stories unfolded, his demeanor softened. By the time dessert rolled around, he was asking questions eagerly, fascinated by the idea of a friendship that had spanned decades. You guys must have been inseparable, Daniel remarked, glancing between his dad and Marcus. What made you stop talking? Elijah and Marcus exchanged a glance, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Finally, Marcus spoke up. Life has a way of pulling people in different directions, he said simply. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it brings them back together again. Daniel seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. That's pretty cool, he said, offering Marcus a tentative smile. I hope I have friends like that someday. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself drawn to Daniel's youthful energy and sharp mind. The boy reminded him of Elijah in many ways, his quick wit, his passion for learning. But there was also something uniquely his own. Watching Elijah interact with his son, Marcus felt a twinge of envy, not for the family itself, but for the sense of belonging it represented. He realized then how much he missed having a community, a group of people who truly saw him for who he was. By the time evening rolled around, Marcus decided it was time to start thinking about heading home. Though he cherished every moment with Elijah and his family, he knew his garage and his responsibilities awaited him back in his small town. Still, saying goodbye wasn't easy. On his final night in Chicago, Elijah took Marcus to Millennium Park, where they strolled beneath twinkling lights and marveled at the city skyline reflected in the water. I wish you didn't have to leave so soon, Elijah admitted as they stood by the famous Cloud Gate sculpture, its mirrored surface distorting their reflections into surreal shapes. But I'm glad you came. You can't imagine how much it means to me. Marcus smiled, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. Me too, man. Me too. Before parting ways, Elijah handed Marcus a small package wrapped in brown paper. For the road, he said cryptically, urging Marcus not to open it until he was back home. Curious but trusting, Marcus tucked the parcel into his bag and promised to call once he arrived safely. The journey back to his hometown felt shorter somehow, as though the warmth of Elijah's friendship had lightened his load. When Marcus finally stepped off the bus and walked through the familiar streets, he noticed something surprising. The hostility he'd encountered before seemed less suffocating. Perhaps it was because he carried a renewed sense of purpose, or Maybe it was because he no longer sought validation from those who refused to give it. Either way, he resolved to focus on building connections with the few neighbors who treated him kindly, like Mrs. Thompson, and to share pieces of his journey with anyone willing to listen. Back in his kitchen, Marcus carefully unwrapped the package Elijah had given him. Inside, he found a framed copy of the faded photograph, the one of the two of them standing beside their lemonade stand. Beneath it, Elijah had written a note. "To my best friend, forever and always. Thank you for reminding me where I came from, and for showing me that some bonds are stronger than time." Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes as he read the words. He placed the frame on his mantel, right next to a clock that ticked steadily despite the years. In that moment, he realized that while the world might try to divide people, there were still threads of connection strong enough to weave them back together. Though Marcus returned to his quiet life, nothing felt quite the same anymore. The anger and frustration that had once simmered beneath the surface began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to live authentically and build bridges wherever he could. And whenever doubt crept in, he looked at the photograph on his mantel, remembering the journey that had changed everything, not just for him but for Elijah, Daniel, and perhaps even the small town he called home. When Marcus returned to his small town, life didn't immediately change. The streets were still lined with the same oak trees, their leaves now a dull brown as winter approached. His garage smelled of oil and metal, just as it always had, and the hum of engines filled the air as he worked on cars day after day. Yet something inside Marcus had shifted. The journey to Chicago hadn't just brought him closer to Elijah. It had awakened a part of him that had long been dormant, a desire to connect, to share, and to challenge the barriers that separated him from others. At first, Marcus kept the changes subtle. He started by inviting Mrs. Thompson over for dinner. One evening, she was the kind neighbor who checked on his house while he was away, and though they'd exchanged pleasantries countless times before, Marcus realized he barely knew anything about her beyond surface-level details. Over steaming plates of fried chicken and mashed potatoes, they talked about everything: her late husband who had loved woodworking, her grandchildren scattered across the country, and the loneliness she sometimes felt living alone. By the end of the meal, both of them agreed it was the start of a deeper friendship. Encouraged by this small victory, Marcus began reaching out to other neighbors too. There was Mr. Patel, the soft-spoken owner of the corner store, who often greeted Marcus with a nod but rarely engaged in conversation. One afternoon, Marcus stopped by the shop not to buy anything, but simply to ask how Mr. Patel's family was doing. To his surprise, the man lit up at the question, pulling out photos of his children and sharing stories of their achievements. It was a simple gesture, but it opened a door between them that hadn't existed before. Still, there were moments when the old frustrations resurfaced. Some people remained distant, their smiles forced and their words clipped. A few even went out of their way to avoid him altogether. But instead of letting bitterness take root again, Marcus chose to focus on what he could control: his own actions and attitude. If someone treated him coldly, he responded with warmth. If someone whispered behind his back, he greeted them with kindness. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere around him began to shift. One particularly chilly morning, Marcus decided to visit the post office again. Not because he needed to send or receive mail, but because he wanted to face the place where his journey had begun. As he pushed open the heavy wooden door, the bell jingled softly, announcing his presence. This time, however, the reaction was different. While some patrons glanced at him curiously, no one crossed the room to avoid him, and the clerk behind the counter gave him a polite nod before returning to her work. Marcus didn't linger long, but the visit left him feeling hopeful. Maybe change wouldn't happen overnight, but it was happening. A little at a time, one interaction at a time. That hope grew stronger when Marcus received a letter from Elijah a few weeks later. It was short but heartfelt, filled with updates about Daniel's basketball games and jokes about Elijah's attempts to learn how to bake bread during quarantine. At the end of the letter, Elijah wrote, "You've inspired me to think more about the connections we make, and the ones we let slip away. I'm starting to reach out to old friends and family members I haven't spoken to in years. It feels good, Marcus. You should try it. Reading those words, Marcus felt a spark ignite within him. He thought about all the people he'd known throughout his life, the teachers who had encouraged him, the co-workers who had shared laughs over coffee breaks, the acquaintances who had once called him friend. How many of those relationships had faded not because of conflict, but simply because he hadn't made the effort to maintain them. With renewed determination, Marcus picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. On the other end, a familiar voice answered hesitantly. "Hello? It's Marcus," he said, smiling despite the nerves fluttering in his stomach. "Marcus Johnson, from high school." There was a pause, followed by a laugh. "Marcus? Wow, it's been ages. How are you?" They talked for nearly an hour, catching up on lives that had taken vastly different paths. By the end of the call, Marcus promised to stay in touch, and he meant it. Over the following weeks, he reached out to several more people from his past, each conversation leaving him feeling lighter and more connected than before. As winter settled over the town, blanketing rooftops and streets in snow, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The letter from Elijah had started it all, a seemingly insignificant piece of paper that had sparked a chain reaction of events. What began as a quest to deliver a message had turned into something much greater, a reminder of the power of human connection. One evening, as Marcus sat by the fireplace flipping through the photo album Elijah had given him, an idea struck him. Why not create something similar for his community, something that celebrated the people who lived here, their stories, their struggles, their triumphs? The thought excited him, and he spent the next few days sketching out plans for a project he called Our Town, Our Stories. The concept was simple. Marcus would interview residents, record their memories, and compile them into a book that captured the essence of the town. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Some people might refuse to participate and others might dismiss the idea entirely, but he was determined to try. To his surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Mrs. Thompson eagerly volunteered to share tales of her youth, while Mr. Patel recounted how he had immigrated to America and built a life from scratch. Even the post office clerk, whose icy demeanor had once cut so deeply, agreed to sit down with Marcus and talk about her love for gardening and her dreams of traveling the world someday. Each story added depth and color to the tapestry of the town, revealing layers of humanity beneath the surface. Through these conversations, Marcus discovered things he never expected: that the elderly woman who had once crossed the room to avoid him was actually terrified of losing her independence, that the teenager who always wore headphones was secretly passionate about poetry, that the mechanic down the street had once dreamed of becoming a musician. As word spread about the project, more and more people became involved. Families hosted gatherings where elders passed down oral histories to younger generations. Children drew pictures depicting their favorite parts of the town, which Marcus included alongside the written accounts. Slowly but surely, walls began to crumble, replaced by bridges built on understanding and empathy. By spring, the book was ready. Marcus organized a launch event at the local library, inviting everyone in town to attend. On the night of the gathering, the room buzzed with energy. People laughed and hugged, marveling at how the stories had brought them closer together. When Marcus stood up to speak, he felt a lump rise in his throat. "I didn't set out to write this book," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion swelling inside him. "I just wanted to deliver a letter. But along the way, I learned something important. We're all connected, whether we realize it or not. Every person has a story worth telling, and every story has the power to bring us closer." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing off the walls like a promise that the town was changing one story at a time. For Marcus, standing there surrounded by faces he now recognized as friends, the journey felt complete. The letter that had changed everything hadn't just delivered a message, it had ignited a movement, one rooted in love, courage, and the unshakable belief that no matter how far apart people may drift, they can always find their way back to each other. The success of Our Town, Our Stories brought a wave of change to Marcus's small community. The book became more than just a collection of memories. It was a mirror reflecting the town's heart and soul. People who had once kept to themselves began seeking out conversations with neighbors they barely knew. Strangers exchanged smiles instead of wary glances, and the library, once a quiet, underused space, became a hub of activity as residents gathered to discuss the stories within its pages. Marcus watched all of this unfold with a mixture of pride and humility. He hadn't set out to transform the town, but he couldn't deny the impact his project had made. Yet, even as things improved, he knew there was still work to be done. While some walls had fallen, others remained stubbornly intact. Prejudices didn't vanish overnight, and old habits died hard, but Marcus refused to let discouragement creep in. Instead, he saw these challenges as opportunities to dig deeper, listen harder, and continue building bridges where none existed before. One day, while working in his garage, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. It was the post office clerk, the same woman whose sharp words had stung him months earlier. She stood awkwardly at the entrance, clutching a small package wrapped in brown paper. Her face was flushed, and she shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other. "Mr. Johnson?" she said hesitantly. "Do you have a moment?" Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward, nodding. "Of course, come in." She entered cautiously, her eyes darting around the cluttered garage. Tools hung neatly on pegboards, and the faint smell of grease lingered in the air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, clearing her throat, she held out the package. I wanted to give you this," she said quickly, avoiding his gaze. "It's not much, but I thought you should have it." Curious, Marcus took the package and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a handmade photo album filled with snapshots of the town's post office through the years. There were pictures of employees posing in front of the building during holidays, children mailing letters to Santa, and community events hosted on the steps outside. On the first page, written in neat cursive, were the words, "Thank you for helping us see what we've been missing." Marcus looked up, surprised. "This is incredible," he said sincerely. "But why are you giving this to me?" The clerk hesitated, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "Because I owe you an apology," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "What happened that day? It wasn't right. I judged you unfairly, and I've regretted it ever since. Seeing how much effort you've put into bringing people together, it made me realize how wrong I was." Her honesty caught Marcus off guard, but he smiled warmly. "Apology accepted," he replied gently. "And thank you for this. It means a lot." As she left, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. If someone like her could acknowledge their mistakes and reach out, then maybe real change was possible after all. Inspired by the clerk's gesture, Marcus decided to take his project a step further. He began organizing monthly storytelling nights at the library, inviting residents to share personal anecdotes in front of an audience. At first, turnout was modest, with only a handful of brave souls willing to speak. But as word spread, the events grew larger, drawing crowds that spilled out into the hallway. During one such evening, an elderly man named Mr. Harper took the stage. Known for his gruff demeanor and reclusive nature, few expected him to say more than a sentence or two. But to everyone's astonishment, he launched into a heartfelt tale about growing up poor in the town and finding solace in books borrowed from the very library they sat in. His voice cracked with emotion as he described how those stories had shaped his life, teaching him empathy and resilience when he needed them most. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, and several people rushed to shake his hand. Later, Marcus approached him with a grin. "You're quite the storyteller, Mr. Harper. Why didn't you tell me you had that in you?" The old man chuckled, looking almost embarrassed. "I didn't think anyone cared," he admitted. "But tonight reminded me that they do, or at least they might if I let them." Moments like these reinforced Marcus's belief in the power of vulnerability. By sharing their truths, people weren't just connecting with each other, they were healing wounds they didn't even know they carried. As summer approached, Marcus received another letter from Elijah. This time, it came with an invitation. Elijah wanted Marcus to join him and his family for a weekend getaway at a cabin near Lake Michigan. Excited yet nervous, Marcus accepted. Though he and Elijah had grown closer through their correspondence, spending extended time with his friend's family felt like stepping into uncharted territory. When he arrived at the cabin, he was greeted with open arms. Daniel, now taller and more confident, immediately dragged Marcus outside to show off his fishing skills. Over the next few days, Marcus bonded with Elijah's wife, Sarah, over shared meals and late-night conversations. They talked about everything, from parenting struggles to dreams they hoped to fulfill someday. By the end of the trip, Marcus felt like part of the family, a feeling he hadn't experienced since childhood. On the drive home, Marcus reflected on the weekend. Being surrounded by love and acceptance had reminded him of something important. Belonging wasn't about geography or bloodlines. It was about showing up, being present and letting others in. And though he cherished his independence, he realized he didn't have to go through life alone. Back in his town, Marcus continued fostering connections wherever he could. He organized volunteer days to clean up local parks, started a mentorship program pairing teenagers with adults who shared similar interests, and even convinced the mayor to host a block party celebrating the town's diversity. Each initiative brought people closer together, breaking down barriers one interaction at a time. One afternoon, while walking through the park, Marcus noticed a group of kids playing soccer. Among them was Jamal, a shy boy whose family had recently moved to the area. Marcus remembered seeing him at the storytelling night, sitting quietly in the corner while his parents introduced themselves to strangers. Feeling a pang of recognition, Marcus approached the field and called out to Jamal, "Hey there, need an extra player?" Jamal hesitated, glancing at his teammates. When they nodded encouragingly, he jogged over, his face lighting up with a tentative smile. As they played, Marcus learned that Jamal loved drawing comics but struggled to make friends because he was new to the town. Inspired, Marcus invited him to contribute illustrations to the next edition of Our Town, Our Stories. By the time the updated version of the book was released, Jamal's artwork had become a highlight, earning praise from readers young and old. More importantly, Jamal had found his place in the community, a transformation Marcus recognized all too well. As autumn returned, painting the trees in fiery hues, Marcus stood on the porch of his home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The journey that had begun with a single letter had taken him farther than he ever imagined, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually. He had faced rejection, anger, and doubt, but he had also discovered courage, forgiveness, and connection. In the distance, he heard laughter drifting from the park, where families gathered for an impromptu picnic. Children chased each other through piles of leaves, their giggles echoing in the crisp air. Neighbors chatted animatedly, swapping recipes and gardening tips. It was a scene of unity Marcus never thought he'd witness in his lifetime. For so long, he had wondered if he truly belonged here, if he would ever find a way to bridge the gap between himself and the people around him. Now, standing amidst the beauty of a town, slowly learning to embrace its differences, Marcus realized the answer lay not in changing others, but in staying true to himself. The letter that had changed everything hadn't just delivered a message. It had sparked a ripple effect, reminding everyone, including Marcus, that no matter how far apart we may drift, we are always capable of finding our way back to each other. And sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to start the journey. As the years passed, Marcus's small town continued to evolve. The seeds of connection he had planted through Our Town, Our Stories, and his countless acts of kindness had grown into a thriving garden of understanding and unity. People, who once avoided eye contact, now greeted each other warmly on the streets. Conversations that used to be limited to polite nods turned into meaningful exchanges about life, dreams, and shared experiences. The town wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was undeniably better than it had been before. Marcus himself had become something of a local legend. His name was mentioned with respect and admiration, not just for the projects he spearheaded, but for the quiet way he carried himself. He didn't seek recognition or applause. Instead, he worked tirelessly behind the scenes, ensuring that everyone felt seen and valued. Whether it was helping an elderly neighbor fix a leaky roof, organizing community events, or simply sitting down to listen to someone's troubles over a cup of coffee, Marcus approached every interaction with sincerity and care. One crisp winter morning, as snow blanketed the ground in a pristine layer of white, Marcus received an unexpected letter in the mail. It bore no return address, only his name scrawled across the envelope in familiar handwriting. Curious, he opened it to find a single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief but powerful. Dear Marcus, you may not remember me, but I'll never forget you. Years ago, you walked into my post office carrying a letter meant for someone else. Back then, I judged you harshly, letting fear and ignorance cloud my judgment. But watching how you've transformed this town and touched so many lives has changed me too. Thank you for showing me what true strength looks like. You've made more of a difference than you'll ever know. With gratitude, a friend who owes you everything. Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes as he read the words. Though the letter didn't reveal the sender's identity, he suspected it was. From the post office clerk, the same woman who had apologized months earlier and gifted him the photo album. Her words filled him with a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that his actions had not only brought people together but also inspired them to grow. The following spring, Marcus decided it was time to take his efforts beyond the borders of his town. Inspired by Elijah's suggestion years ago, he began reaching out to nearby communities, sharing the story of his journey and offering guidance on how they could foster similar connections within their own neighborhoods. Word of his work spread quickly, and soon invitations poured in from schools, churches, and civic organizations eager to hear him speak. At first, Marcus hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he enjoyed. He preferred working quietly in the background, letting his actions speak louder than his words. But Elijah reminded him of the ripple effect even a single voice could create. Sometimes, Elijah had said during one of their phone calls, people need to hear your story to believe change is possible. So, with a mix of nerves and determination, Marcus accepted the invitations. At each event, he stood before crowds of strangers and shared his journey, from the day he was scorned at the post office to the moment he realized the power of human connection. He spoke openly about his struggles, his doubts, and the moments of hope that kept him moving forward. And he always ended with the same message: we are stronger together than we are apart. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change someone's world, including your own. His speeches resonated deeply with audiences. Teachers wrote to tell him how his words inspired their students to start anti-bullying campaigns. Business owners implemented programs to support underserved members of their communities. Families reconnected after decades of estrangement, spurred by Marcus's reminder that it's never too late to rebuild broken bridges. Each story of impact reinforced Marcus's belief in the goodness of humanity. Back home, Marcus remained grounded despite the growing acclaim. He continued running his garage, fixing cars with the same dedication and precision he'd always shown. On weekends, he volunteered at the library, mentoring young writers who dreamed of telling their own stories. One such writer was Jamal, whose illustrations had become a beloved feature of subsequent editions of Our Town, Our Stories. Under Marcus's guidance, Jamal developed confidence in his art and eventually earned a scholarship to study design at a prestigious university. When Jamal graduated high school, Marcus attended the ceremony, beaming with pride as his protege delivered a speech thanking those who had believed in him. Mr. Johnson taught me that everyone has a story worth telling, Jamal said, looking directly at Marcus in the audience, and that sometimes all it takes is one person to remind you of your worth. As the crowd erupted in applause, Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't set out to change anyone's life. He'd simply tried to live his own authentically. Yet here he was, surrounded by evidence of the impact he'd made. Years later, when Marcus looked back on his life, he marveled at how much had changed since that fateful day at the post office. What had started as a simple errand to deliver a letter had blossomed into a lifetime of purpose and connection. The town he once felt alienated from had become a place where he truly belonged, not because it had changed entirely, but because he had learned to see its beauty through new eyes. Elijah remained his closest confidant, and their friendship deepened with age. They visited each other regularly, swapping stories about their families and reflecting on the paths their lives had taken. Daniel, now grown and pursuing a career in education, often joked that Marcus was the cool uncle he never knew he needed. Even Sarah, Elijah's wife, teased that Marcus had spoiled her husband rotten with his constant reminders of their shared history. In his quieter moments, Marcus often thought about the letter that had sparked it all. That faded photograph of two boys standing beside a lemonade stand had been more than just a nostalgic keepsake. It had been a symbol of resilience, reminding him that some bonds are unbreakable, no matter how much time passes or how far apart people drift. On the mantel above his fireplace, the framed copy of the photograph still sat proudly. Beneath it, Elijah's note remained visible. "To my best friend, forever and always." Those words served as a daily reminder of the enduring power of friendship and of the courage it takes to reach across divides. When Marcus finally retired from his mechanic shop, the entire town came together to celebrate his legacy. Plaque was placed outside the library commemorating "Our Town, Our Stories," with an inscription honoring Marcus as its founder. During the ceremony, Mrs. Thompson took the stage, her voice trembling with emotion as she recounted the countless ways Marcus had touched her life and the lives of others. "You didn't just fix cars, Marcus," she said, wiping away tears. "You fixed hearts. You showed us that no matter how different we seem on the surface, we're all connected by the stories we share. And for that, we'll be forever grateful." As the crowd erupted in applause, Marcus stood quietly, overwhelmed by the love surrounding him. He glanced around at the faces of his neighbors, friends, and family, realizing that this moment was the culmination of everything he had worked toward. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. In the end, Marcus understood that the letter that changed everything hadn't just altered the course of his life. It had ignited a movement. It had reminded him, and countless others, that while walls may divide us, stories have the power to bring us together. And sometimes, all it takes is one brave soul to start sharing their truth to inspire a chain reaction of healing, growth, and unity. As Marcus settled into retirement, content in the knowledge that he had left the world a little brighter than he found it, he smiled at the thought of future generations continuing the work he had started. After all, the power of connection is timeless, and the stories we tell will always shape the world we live in.